Fiona Campbell-Howes. She was born in Inverness and grew up in Nairnshire and Moray. After a long career as a technology writer, she returned to academia in 2022 to further a lifelong interest in early medieval Moray. Having gained a scholarship to the MA History Medieval Studies program at the University of Birmingham, she graduated with distinction in 2024. And she's now pursuing a PhD at the University of Glasgow, taking an interdisciplinary approach to uncovering the early medieval ecclesiastical and secular history of the Moray Firthlands. Amazingly, this amazed me because I assumed that because she's so immersed in the early medieval period of Moray and Ross, I assumed she lived in Elgin or somewhere like that, but no, she lives in Cornwall and pursues all this amazing research from hundreds of miles away. I do recommend her blog, the Rabbit Holes of Early Medieval Scotland, or something like that.
Yep,
Wonderful
that's
things
great.
appear there regularly. Um, and so drawing on her ongoing PhD research, she will consider lots of new evidence for the early church in our region, including new insights into Curetán-Boniface and his medieval cult. And so I'm going to hand over to Fiona.
Lovely. Thank you, Alistair, for that introduction and for inviting me to give the Groam House annual academic lecture. I mean, it's a huge honour to follow in the footsteps of the previous very illustrious givers of this lecture, some of whose work I'll be drawing on tonight. I should say that when Alistair kindly invited me to give this lecture back in January, I was only 3 months into a 5-year PhD, and I wasn't sure how much new research I would have to share with you. So, as you may be able to tell from my catch-all title here, I was hedging my bets somewhat. But as Alistair mentioned, my hope was that I would be able to build on the research presented by the late Aidan MacDonald in his 1992 Groam House Lecture on Curadán-Boniface and the Early Church of Rosemarkie. This has actually remained the definitive work on the enigmatic St. Curadán ever since. In fact, anytime Curadán is mentioned in any academic book or paper, you'll find a footnote to MacDonald 1992. But in the intervening 33 years, there have been many advances in our understanding of the early church in Easter Ross and the Moray Firthlands, including one very significant advance in our understanding of the career of Curadán himself. These advances have created an opportunity to revisit this late 7th century bishop to see if we can get a clearer view of his career, his connection with Rosemarkie and Ross, and how he fits into the wider context of the early church in the Moray Firthlands and in Scotland more broadly. So that's what I'm aiming to do tonight. And I couldn't have done any of it without Aidan MacDonald's foundational work. And I'd like to dedicate this lecture to his memory. So if we start with what we know for certain, or as certain as we can ever be about anything from the early Middle Ages about Curadán, we know that he was active around the turn of the 8th century because he was one of 91 people who pledged at the Synod of Birr in 697 to uphold the new law code introduced by Adamnan, 9th Abbot of Iona. This was called the Law of the Innocents. It was an early piece of international legislation designed to protect non-combatants in battle, mainly women and children, from violence. It was guaranteed by clerics and kings from Ireland, the Gaelic-speaking kingdom of Dalriada, and Pictland. Curadán appears at number 22 on the list of 91 guarantors appended to the code, with the title Episcop Bishop. He's listed between a bishop of Iona, Kethi or Coithi, and another bishop named Connemall, who scholars also place in the Hebrides, although there's some disagreement as to who he actually was. This suggests that all 3 bishops formed part of a contingent from North Britain, by which I mean Dalriada and Pictland, so there was no Scotland at that time. We also know that he died on the 16th of March, although we don't know what year. That might seem like a trivial detail, but it's actually the key to keeping track of Curadán across the centuries. So the Law of the Innocents doesn't say where he was bishop of, but we can find this information in another text known as the Martyrology of Tallaght. This is a calendar of saints' feast days that was compiled at the monastery of Tallaght near Dublin between 828 and 833 AD. The original text is long lost, and it only survives now in 2 much later copies or sources. One of them is the Book of Leinster on the left there, which is a 12th century codex containing copies of many older texts. Under the 16th of March, we find a commemoration which reads, Holy Curadán, Bishop and Abbot of Ross Minbarand. A metrical, a poetic version of the Martyrology of Tallaght was composed in 1167, known as the Martyrology of Gorman. And here, under the 16th of March, we find Curadán, Curetán, with a note reading Bishop and Abbot of Ross Main. So for centuries, these place names made it very difficult to be certain exactly where he was bishop of. But there was a temptation to place them at Rosemarkie for three reasons. Firstly, a saint with a similar name, Curetánus, is connected with Rosemarkie in a later medieval text. We'll have a look at that text a bit later. Secondly, there's a large assemblage of very fine early medieval sculpture at Rosemarkie, which is now on display at the excellent Groam House Museum, which strongly suggests that it was the site of an early monastery. And lastly, there were numerous place names in Easter Ross and in Venetia that contain the name Curadán, which suggests he had a strong cult here. So scholars tried very hard to explain Ross Minbarand and Ross Main as garbled versions of Rosemarkie, but any intellectually honest scholar had to admit that this wasn't linguistically possible. MacDonald himself said that on the available evidence, Ross Minbarand and Ross Main cannot be equated with Rosemarkie. But there was a breakthrough in 2009 when James Fraser, in a book chapter that's noted at the bottom there, showed that in the original Martyrology of Tallaght, Curadán had been originally followed by a commemoration of another cleric called Minbarand. In the version used as the source for the Book of Leinster and the Martyrology of Gorman, these two commemorations had accidentally been run together, creating the garbled name. Removing Minbarand's name leaves the commemoration as Curadán, Bishop and Abbot of Ross. This means that we can now confidently say that he was Bishop of Ross in the Moray Firthlands. We can also say a tiny bit more about when he lived. We know that he was alive in 697 to guarantee the law of the innocents, but how long did his career last? His year of death isn't recorded in any source, but research by Podrigo Rian gives us a clue. In 2006, he worked out that the 9th century Martyrology of Tallaght, which is in the middle there, was actually based, essentially a copy of an older version of the calendar, which was kept on Iona between 715 and 740. Now, Curadán's entry belongs to this older calendar, which means that he died sometime between 697 and 740. So not only do we know that he was Bishop and Abbot of Ross, we also know that Bishop and Abbot of Ross was the title he was known by, either in his own lifetime or very soon afterwards. We have so little written evidence for the Firthlands in the 8th century that Curadán is currently the only named person that we can confidently place in the region at this time. So any other information we can reliably glean about him is like gold dust. Unfortunately, gleaning additional reliable information about Curadán is very difficult. As with very many early saints, after his death, his legend took on a life of its own. As it was copied in different places and used for different purposes, information was added and removed. Information also got corrupted through miscopying, misinterpretation, or deliberate repurposing. One major development was that at some point he acquired an alter ego, Boniface, who then became partially detached from Curadán and developed a legend of his own. We'll see later that Boniface may have entered the picture sometime in the first half of the 12th century. Both Curadán and Boniface are also persistently connected with a Pictish king called Nectan, although it's not always the same King Nectan. Because of that, historians have tended to link him to the church reforms introduced by King Nectan mac between 710 and 717. This is when the church in Pictland went over to the Roman method of calculating the date of Easter, as described by the Venerable Bede in 731. Historians like Kenneth Veitch and Juliana Grigg, as well as Aidan MacDonald himself, have suggested that Curadán played a major role in that programme of reform. He's also been credited with the foundation of many churches dedicated to St. Peter all across Scotland, across Pictland, including most persistently churches at Invergowrie and Resteneth in Angus. But how much, if any of this, is actually true? Now, Aidan MacDonald collected every scrap of information that he could possibly find about Curadán and Boniface to try to answer that question. And in doing so, he created an excellent source book for anybody who wants to try to separate fact from fiction in Curadán's legend. It's what I've used as the basis for this lecture tonight. But because he couldn't confidently place Curadán in Ross, he felt he'd failed in his quest, saying, "I cannot claim to have contributed anything new or revolutionary to the study of Curadán. I have failed to lighten significantly the darkness that still surrounds him." I think that was a bit modest. I think he did come up with some pretty good and interesting information, but he didn't feel that he had. He did feel that he'd put together more information than anybody had had previously, and that somebody might be able to find it to use it to find a way forward. So now in 2025, we know much more than MacDonald did about the real Curadán. With the confusion around Ross min Baron gone, we can be confident he was bishop and abbot of Ross in the years around 700. So with this anchor information, we can go back to the sources that MacDonald collected and try to make more sense of them than he was able to. It's still very complex, but I think quite a bit of progress is actually possible. So just to give you an idea, you're not supposed to be able to read this. Just to give you an idea of the complexity, this is a snapshot of a spreadsheet in which I've recorded information from all of the textual sources that MacDonald gathered. So there are 32 sources in total, from the Law of the Innocents itself in 697 to William Forbes Skeen's 3-volume History of Celtic Scotland in 1888. I put them in chronological order as best as I was able to, and I noted what each source said about key aspects of the saint: his name, his feast day, his title, where he came from, where he died, which churches he founded, if any, and so on. I used colour coding to indicate when a new piece of information was added, and when a later source has reused earlier information, I kept the same colour from the earlier source. This was a really torturous exercise, but I do really recommend it as you start to get a really good idea of how saints' legends develop, proliferate and splinter off, and how confusion sets in. You will be relieved to know that I'm not going to go into each of these texts in detail. Instead, I'm going to split the sources into 4 types and see what we can learn from each one. So those 4 types, the first one is martyrologies. So as we've seen, these were calendars of saints' feast days kept by churches before the Reformation. They mostly just tell us the saint's name, the name of their church, and the day they died. Second source is hagiography. So these are accounts of a saint's deeds, often written long after the saint died. In some cases, the original life is lost, but fragments of it are preserved in short texts meant for reading out in church on the saint's feast day. As these lives and legends can be valuable historical sources, but they weren't ever intended to be factual biographies, so we have to use them with extreme caution. Third source type is historiography, the writing of history. Medieval and modern historians have drawn on the first 2 source types, so they've drawn on martyrologies and hagiography to try to give Curadán a historical context. Unfortunately, this hasn't always resulted in greater clarity, as we'll see. And the last source type is onomastics, the study of names, in this case, place names and church names. This type of evidence can be very valuable in its own right, and as we'll see, also a useful control against which to assess the other types. I should say that working through all of these sources has been pretty complicated, and there may well be things that I failed to take into account. So I would be interested to hear anybody's thoughts and questions afterwards. So to the martyrology. So from the 8th century Iona calendar, preserved in the Martyrology of Tallaght, all the way to the Reformation and beyond, a series of calendars kept in Ireland, Europe and Scotland continue to commemorate a saint from Scotland on the all-important date of the 16th of March. By the late 12th century, they're starting to lose sight of the fact that this person was called Curadán and that he was bishop of a diocese called Ross. I suspect this is at least partly due to the scribal error that had turned it into the mysterious Ross min Baron. That error was made certainly before the 1160s, possibly even as early as the 9th century. So instead, around 1400, we can see 2 new pieces of information appearing. The first is that he was Albanus, which means he's from Scotland, which is still accurate, but less precise than Ross. And the second is that he also had a Latin cognomen or nickname of Boniface. This is a crucial development, and we can date it to 1195 at the very latest. In that year, 1195, or very soon afterwards, the English chronicler Roger of Howden wrote that it is said that in the Episcopal Cathedral Church of Ross, which is called Rosemarkie, lies buried the blessed Pope Boniface, who was fourth after Blessed Gregory. Now, this is the earliest recorded mention of a Boniface in connection with Curadán. It suggests that the Church of Rosemarkie was, at least by the late 12th century, claiming to be the burial place of Pope Boniface IV. We'll look at how and why that might have happened later. If we go back to the calendars, we can see that Curadán's name has also been Latinized to Curetánus, which also weakens the connection to the real historical person, especially as Curetánus then often gets misspelled. As the calendars continue to be copied, and these are just examples that I've pulled out, there are other calendars. As they continue to be copied, this information too gets corrupted. In one 15th century calendar, he's commemorated as three separate people: Bishop Boniface, Bishop and Confessor Albanus, and Saint Kinneddar. Albanus also gets misinterpreted as a third name, Abanus or Aban. In 1526, we see him commemorated as Saint Abane, who's also called Saint Kirin, whose surname was Boniface. And in 1872, he's become encrusted with names: St. Bonifacius, surnamed Curetánus, by others called Albanus Curetánus, surnamed Bonifacius. We're a long way now from Bishop Curadán of Ross. One thing that I found really interesting in researching this was that locally, because these are traditions in different places, not everybody has the same information at the same time. Locally, in the Black Isle and Easter Ross, all mention of Curadán under that name stops dead after the 12th century, so no Curetánus. I've only included local calendars here. This was a calendar of Fern, but in every local textual source that I found, from 1195 until the late 19th century, the saint is only ever called Boniface. I haven't quite worked out the implications of this yet, but I think it may be significant for how we view the place names that contain the name Curadán. They may be very old, but that's a topic for another time. So our second source type is hagiography. At various points in the Middle Ages, there was a tradition of writing the lives and legends of saints, recording their saintly deeds and the places where they operated. These lives were usually produced at a church that was founded or thought to be founded by the saint in question, or which held or was thought to hold the body or relics of that saint. Unfortunately, they can't be considered reliable biographies. They were often written much later than the saint's own lifetime, and they tend to be full of embellishments and fabrications driven by the practical politics of the time of writing. One such practicality was the need to claim or defend the church's ownership of certain properties or its enjoyment of certain rights. Another was the need to attract patronage and pilgrimage by beefing up the importance of the saint and the power of his or her relics. A third was to emphasize the importance of the church itself, often in a bid to encourage or prevent some change in its status. So all this can result in wildly differing legends of the same saint, depending on when and where the life was written and the preoccupations of the church at the time of writing. So in that context, we can look at two quite different legends of Curadán that were circulating in the later Middle Ages. One is lost. The one on the left here is lost, but it was transcribed by a group of 7th century, part of it was transcribed by a group of 7th century scholars working in Belgium. For clarity, I've called it the Legend of St. Curetánus. The other appears in the Aberdeen Breviary of 1510, Scotland's first printed book. I've called it the Legend of St. Boniface. So we start with the legend of St. Curetánus. We know that it was copied in 1668 from a now lost manuscript that came from Utrecht. The original was in Latin. This is Aidan MacDonald's translation here. It's quite short, so we can look at it all. It says, "Then Nectanius, king of the Picts, inspired by the will of God, was baptized, and he gave the place of the baptistry to St. Curetánus with its entire province, to be administered by the pilgrim servants of Christ, free from any dependence ever after. And after receiving a blessing, the king returned to his court. And St. Curetánus, bearing with him many relics of the apostles and many other saints, founded a church at the mouth of the river Gobriat in Pictland and consecrated it. And he evangelized the Picts and Scots for 60 years and built a splendid church in Rosemarkie. And here he performed many miracles, which I won't read because you can read them there. They are standard miracles for a saint's life, and we shouldn't consider them to be factual. At last, when he had completed 80 years of his life, 3 months and 17 days, he departed to the Lord on the 17th of the calends of April, the all-important 16th of March, and he was buried in the same city, that is, Rosemarkie, in the church of St. Peter before the altar, where he shines forth in daily signs and miracles. Now, Aidan MacDonald noted 3 things about this fragment. Firstly, the saint is only called Curetánus, a Latinized rendition of his Gallic name Curadán. There's no sign of Boniface here. This gives us a clue that we could be dealing with a text that was produced before the 12th century, when references to Boniface first appear. Secondly, MacDonald also noted the very precise elaboration of Curetánus's age and death day. He compared it to an entry in the Annals of Tigernach for 722, which records that Maelrua of Applecross died in the 80th year of his life, 3 months and 29 days, on the 11th of the calends of May. MacDonald didn't really comment any further, but Podrigar Rian has noted elsewhere that precise elaborations like this suggest an interest in computus, the art of calculating dates, including the date of Easter. This perhaps hints at an early medieval origin for the legend of St. Curetánus. Thirdly, and crucially, MacDonald homed in on the name of the river Gobriat, at whose mouth Curetánus founded a church. He noted that this is a very old name form, but he wasn't able to say how old. However, my PhD co-supervisor, Professor Thomas Clancy, has confirmed that this form seems to be early medieval. This is another clue that at least some of this text might have been written in the early Middle Ages. It also raises vital questions over which river is meant. From the 16th century onwards, historians have taken it to mean the Gowrie Burn in Angus. This carved cross-slab indicates that there probably was an early church at Invergowrie, and there is a ruined church there, so it's a reasonable interpretation. MacDonald didn't actively dispute that, but he did note a problem with it. The earliest spellings of both Gowrie and Invergowrie from the 12th and early 13th century have it as Gowrin or Gowran with an en or an in at the end, not Gobriat. On the face of it, the Gowrie Burn isn't the river intended. Now, MacDonald noted that the name Gobriat is actually identical in form to the name of a different burn, the Gowrie Burn that flows into the River Orrin near Muir of Ord in East Ross. That name, according to the toponymist W.J. Watson, is Gaelic Gowrie, goat burn. However, Watson felt that the name itself is older than Gaelic and may once have been something like the Gaulish Gabretta, which means goat wood, and that is very close to Gobriat. Despite this, it doesn't seem to have occurred to MacDonald that Curadán might have founded a church at the mouth of the Gowrie Burn in Easter Ross. But given that we know what he didn't, that the real Curadán was Bishop of Ross, I think we should keep that possibility very much in mind. Now, that was all that Aidan MacDonald had to say about this text, but I think we can say quite a bit more. We've seen 3 clues that it might be early in date, so we can analyse it with that in mind. First, we should note that the only church mentioned by name is Rosemarkie. It clearly states that Curetánus built the church at Rosemarkie, performed many miracles there, was buried in the church before the altar, and continues to perform posthumous miracles from the spot. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that this legend was written in, or at least on behalf of, the Church of Rosemarkie. As a monastery, it could well have had a scriptorium, so this is perfectly feasible. We also see a statement implying that Curetánus baptized King Nectan of Picts, in return for which he received the place of the baptism, which isn't named, plus its entire province, free from any dependence. This seems to be a claim to jurisdiction over a certain area, granted by a king, and therefore not to be contested, tampered with, or taken away. Since we know that Curadán was Bishop of Ross, we might infer that the province in question was his diocese of Ross. The wording here suggests that its independence might have been under some kind of threat at the time of writing. We need to tread warily, though, because we know that Curadán was already a bishop in the reign of Nectan's predecessor, his brother Bryddei, who was king of Picts from 697 to his death in 706. So unless Curadán moved dioceses in Nectan's time, and we'll see evidence that suggests he didn't, he was already Bishop of Ross when Nectan became king. So we should maybe take with a pinch of salt the statement that Nectan granted him the province or diocese. But it is notable that the only people named are Curadán and Nectan. This is another hint that this text is very old. If the autonomy of Rosemarkie and Ross was under threat, the church would have wanted to make the strongest possible claim to independence. It seems that the name of names of Curadán and Nechdán were thought to have enough clout on their own without having to name anybody else. And that's interesting because there's a separate late medieval tradition that Saint Maluag, the founder of the monastery of Lismore in Loch Linnhe, who died in 592, was also buried at Rosemarkie. Now, Aidan MacDonald and Alex Wolfe have both proposed that this tradition was introduced into the Firthlands in the later 9th or 10th century by the incoming Kenell-Lorne kindred of the Gallic kingdom of Dalriada, now Argyll. Their thinking was that Viking attacks displaced them from their home territory in Lorne, and when they fled up the Great Glen to Pictland, they brought with them at least some of the relics of their patron saint and enshrined them at Rosemarkie. On the face of it then, the legend of Curetánus could date from before these claims started to be made about Maluag at Rosemarkie, but after enough time had passed for people not to be suspicious of a claim that Nechdán had granted the Diocese of Ross to Curadán. As I mentioned earlier, it seems probable that Curadán died before 740, and we know from the Irish annals that Nechdán died around 732. So if we add a generation or two, that would bring us to 762 or 792. So taking all of this evidence together, there are some good signs that the legend of Curetánus could have been written in Rosemarkie as early as the 8th century. That's quite exciting because this text hasn't previously been recognised as a possibly early text. It does need more analysis, but one implication is that it may provide a near contemporary northern perspective on Nechdán mac Deirillai's reform of the Pictish church around 716. Certainly, the account of Curetánus building a splendid church in Rosemarkie dedicated to St. Peter seems to point to that time. It may also have something to tell us about political tensions in the Firthlands at the time of writing. The sense it gives is that the Church of Rosemarkie, the Diocese of Ross, and the church at the mouth of the Gobriat are under threat and having to defend their legitimacy and their independence. That's interesting, certainly to me, because if you've seen my talks elsewhere, or if you've seen my master's dissertation, you'll know that I've proposed that the Firthlands were divided into two territories in the 8th century, Ross and Moreb, ancestors of Ross and Moray. I essentially see Moreb as spanning the Moray Firth, incorporating the Tarbat Peninsula and the southern shore of the Dornoch Firth, including the major monastery at Portmahomack. Now, the monastery at Portmahomack and other sites in the area that I see as Moreb seem to have received a major influx of wealth and patronage in the late 8th century. That's reflected in a series of magnificent carved cross slabs and other monuments that stretch from Kincardine at the head of the Dornoch Firth, just at Bonner Bridge there, to Burghead and Elgin, south of the Moray Firth. This sculpture includes imagery of the biblical King David, of the hunt, and of the armed horseman, all of which have been associated with Pictish concepts of kingship. The quality of the workmanship is superb, and the Nig cross slab in particular has been hailed by George and Isabel Henderson as second to none in the history of Western medieval art. It's striking that none of these motifs appear on sculpture in the area that I see as Ross, which has much less early ecclesiastical sculpture in any case. There's also mounting evidence presented earlier this year by Victoria Thompson and Thomas Keyes that the Book of Kells itself might have been made at Portmahomack around 800. If you haven't seen their talk on this, I highly recommend it. There's a link to the recording on the Tarbat Discovery Centre websites, and it's well worth the £3 ticket fee. So this is pure speculation, but it may be that the patrons behind this late northern flowering of Pictish art had their sights set on the neighbouring territory of Ross, including Rosemarkie and its diocese. There's certainly a royal swagger about some of the monuments that they patronised. If so, and that is a big if, the fact that a superb cross slab with Pictish symbols was raised at Rosemarkie around 800 might suggest that these individuals achieved their aims. In that case, the installation of the cross slab could be compared to raising a flag in newly appropriated territory. On that note, we might also quickly consider the Conan stone, this wonderful symbol-bearing cross slab that was discovered by Anne McInnes of Nosas at Logie Wester near Conan Bridge in 2019. This is the only other Pictish Class II cross slab located in the area that I see as Ross, and I would be personally tempted to see it as part of the same expansion from Moreb towards the end of the 8th century. It is notable on that front that Thomas Clancy has identified the name Logie Wester as containing a possibly Pictish ecclesiastical place name element, login, meaning a church. There's an interesting contrast there with the many places in Ross that have the Gaelic ecclesiastical place name element cill, as we'll see in a bit. I know there's currently a dedicated master's research project underway at the University of the Highlands and Islands to investigate this stone, and it'll be really interesting to see the findings of that. Okay, so we've seen that the legend of St. Curetánus shows multiple signs of being early in date, early medieval in date even, and that it matches up reasonably well with what we know about the real historical Curadán. With that in mind, we can turn to the other text, which I'm calling the Legend of St. Boniface. This one appears in the Aberdeen Breviary of 1510, which contains legends of 92 saints, I think, divided into small chunks called lections for reading on their feast day. For the 16th of March, we find the readings for a saint named Boniface, who has a few things in common with Curetánus, including the all-important feast day. The text of this is much, much longer, so I'll just summarize the key points here. So Boniface was an Israelite. He was a nephew of the apostles Peter and Andrew. He became pope in the time of the Byzantine Emperor Maurice from 582 to 602. But inspired by a vision of St. Peter, he abdicated the papacy in order to travel to Pictland. And he took with him a large entourage of clerics, including bishops Servandus and Medianus and abbesses Crescentia and Triduana. Now they landed at an unnamed place in the Firth of Forth and made their way to Resteneth, which is a little bit of an odd way to get to Resteneth, but there you go. They were met at Resteneth by King Nectan of the Picts and baptized him there. And in return, he gave them the place of the baptism, Resteneth, in this legend, in the name of the Holy Trinity. And here he performed more or less the same miracles as Curetánus, and he died in his 84th year on the 16th of March. Now, Aidan MacDonald noted that in this legend, the saint is only called Boniface. There's no sign of Curadán here or Curetánus. He's also presented as a pope who lived at the same time as the Byzantine Emperor Maurice and a King Nectan of Picts. Maurice reigned from 582 to 602, and a Nectan grandson of Verb was king of Picts from around 601 to around 621. So the dates don't quite overlap, but this all suggests that Boniface is to be identified with Pope Boniface IV, who was Pope from, I've got here 607 to 615, but here it says 608. So round about that time. This doesn't seem to be the historical Curadán that we know. And to understand how that might have happened, we have to go on a quick detour. So how did Curadán become Boniface? The claim that Resteneth was founded by a 7th century Pope Boniface is interesting because, as we saw earlier, in 1195, the Church of Rosemarkie seems to have been claiming it was the burial place of Pope Boniface IV. Now, this isn't actually true because Boniface IV is on record as being buried in Rome, as you might expect. We've got no direct evidence for why Rosemarkie was making this claim, so we can't say for sure. However, my suspicion is that Curadán was reinvented as Boniface in the second quarter of the 12th century because his name was no longer powerful enough to deal with new political realities. Intriguingly, Thomas Clancy has noted that Boniface could actually be a play on words of Curadán's name. Bonum facies in Latin means good face, and cor edon in early Gaelic, Old Irish, means proper brow. So reinventing Curadán as Boniface may have been like a white lie that helped the church to defend itself. What might it have been defending against? We can't actually say, but we do know that in 1130, David I of Scots took control of Moray after defeating a northern challenge to the kingship. That led to him reorganising the northern church, installing a new bishopric of Moray with its cathedral at Burney near Elgin. Aidan MacDonald speculated that there was an attempt to fold Rosemarkie and Ross into this new diocese. That would have meant Rosemarkie losing its cathedral status, in which case a claim that it held the body of a pope might have helped it to stay independent. If so, it was partially successful, as the Diocese of Ross remained separate from the Diocese of Moray until the Reformation, although the cathedral itself was moved in the 13th century from Rosemarkie to neighbouring Fortrose. So I'd stress that this is all very much speculation. We don't have enough insight into the Firthlands prior to 1150 to have any clear idea of what was happening. But bishoprics were used as political tools throughout the Middle Ages, so it's at least worth considering. So back to Resteneth. The claim that it was founded by St. Boniface, not Curadán, should alert us to the possibility that this legend was produced in or after the 12th century. It's also notable that Resteneth is the only place mentioned. In this legend, it's the place where Boniface baptizes Knechten and receives the church from him in return. Now, Bede tells us that in the 710s, Aidan MacDonald invited Northumbrian masons to come and build a stone church dedicated to St. Peter somewhere in Pictland. On the basis of Bede's account and the fact that there is a record of an early church called Eglspether, Peter's Church, somewhere nearby, Resteneth is often considered to be that place. However, the legend of St. Boniface states that the church at Resteneth was dedicated to the Holy Trinity, not Peter, which undermines that claim somewhat. There's also no mention of a province in the legend of St. Boniface, suggesting that it's not a claim to jurisdiction over an area. Crucially, there's also no mention of a river Gobriat or Gowring. The only body of water mentioned is the Firth of Forth, and there's no mention of Rosemarkie or anywhere in northern Pictland at all. MacDonald didn't draw any firm conclusions from any of this, but it seems conceivable to me that the legend of St. Boniface was produced at Resteneth Priory. That's because Resteneth is the only church mentioned, and it's cast as a royal church with a history going back to the 7th century, a papal founder, and a bevy of additional saints, Pinsandus, Servandus, Crescentia, Triduana, and so on, shoring up its pedigree. Elsewhere in the 12th century, accounts like this were used to provide a sense of deep-seated continuity for a new foundation. Resteneth was founded as an Augustinian priory in the 12th century, so this legend may date to that time. Certainly, there's no material evidence at Resteneth to suggest it was founded as early as the 8th century, although there is some stonework that has been dated to the 11th century, I think, so more investigation is needed. So in these two legends, we see the historical Curadán effectively split into two different saints with two different names, operating in two different centuries in two different parts of Scotland. Although there are similarities between them, not least the feast day of the 16th of March, there are also strong signs that they were produced at different times and for different purposes. This leads on to our third category of evidence, historiography. From the late Middle Ages onwards, historians began to knit the two legends together in the belief that they both contained reliable information about a historical person who was called both Curadán and Boniface. I'll just briefly discuss two examples. One is from Andrew of Winton's original Chronicle of Scotland from around 1409, and one is from Hector Boyce's Histories of the Scots, published in 1527. Now, Winton's Chronicle contains 30,000 lines of Scots verse and relates the history of Scotland from the creation to his own time, a fairly ambitious scope. He wrote that Rosemarkie was founded in 716 by Aidan MacDonald and in 600 during the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Maurice, without remarking on any contradiction between them. In 1527, Hector Boyce linked a saint he calls Boniface Quiritanus to Aidan MacDonald's Romanist reforms of the Pictish Church. He claimed that the saint founded churches dedicated to St. Peter at Invergowrie, Teeling, Resteneth, and then throughout the provinces of Angus, Mearns, Mar, Buchan, Strathbogie, and Moray, before finally founding Rosemarkie and Ross and dying there. Since there's nothing about any of these other churches in the martyrologies or the legends, it seems highly likely that Boyce is just attributing all churches with St. Peter dedications to Curadán-Boniface. It's his way of reconciling the fact that his sources have the saint operating in both Angus and Ross. And this historical view hasn't really changed. Since Boyce's day, you'll still read that Curadán-Boniface was a major player in Aidan's church reforms, and that he founded churches dedicated to St. Peter in Angus and throughout Scotland. This, for example, is an extract of Historic Environment Scotland's Statement of Significance for Resteneth Priory to that exact effect. And this sort of sticking facts is especially true of the Church of St. Peter at Invergowrie. As far as I can tell, Hector Boyce was the first historian in 1527 to claim that it was founded by our saint. As we've seen, it doesn't feature in the legend of Curetánus or the legend of Boniface, which only mention Rosemarkie and Resteneth, but this factoid has stuck ever since. Now, I have a strong suspicion that it came about because Boyce, or possibly one of his sources, had interpreted the mouth of the river Gobriat from the legend of Curetánus as Invergowrie. And it stuck partly because there's sculptural evidence that there was an early church at Invergowrie. But as we've seen, there is another possibility that the real Curadán founded a church at the mouth of the Gowrie Burn in Easter Ross. The fourth and final category of evidence, place names and dedications, adds more weight to this interpretation. So as we saw at the start, the Martyrology of Tallaght tells us that the historical Curadán was a bishop and abbot of Ross who was active around 700. This near contemporary evidence gives no hint that he had any connection with Angus or any other part of Pictland, and this is supported by the place name evidence. There are 11 known place names and church names in Scotland, in the whole of Scotland, that contain the name Curadán, and they are all in Easter Ross, the Aird, Glenurquhart and Strathglass, with one at Rosemarkie itself. The inset map here shows them. You can see there's none anywhere else in Scotland. It is notable that these names overlap significantly with a cluster of names starting with Kill for Gaelic Kill, a church. I've highlighted some examples here. So Kilavoida, Killin, Kiltarlety, Killeanan. Now these names are often, but not always, a sign of an early medieval Gaelic church foundation. Since we know that Curadán was a bishop, the area of overlap is strongly suggestive of the extent of his diocese. If that's the case, it extended from Urquhart on Loch Ness, roughly to Strathrory in Easter Ross. What we don't see, and I think this is crucial, is place name evidence that Curadán or his cult, his original cult, was ever active beyond this corner of the Firthlands. It is for this reason that when the legend of Curetánus says that Curadán, not Boniface, founded a church at the mouth of the river Gobriat, we should think seriously about whether this meant at Altgowrie near Muir of Ord. There's no recorded church site here, and there's nothing much to see on the ground. Well, I haven't been there, but from the aerial view, it didn't seem like there's much to see on the ground. But this doesn't mean there never was a church there. We know from charter evidence, for example, that there was once a medieval parish church here at Dunballach on the River Bewley. The church site was moved to Kirkhill in the Aird in 1221, leaving nothing visible behind. If there was a church at Altgowrie, it might have been decommissioned before charter records begin, perhaps moving to Urry, where the parish church is now. And with that, I will just quickly summarise what I've covered in this lecture. So we've known since 2009 that Curadán was Bishop of Ross around 700, but nobody had really gone back to the primary sources in light of that knowledge. Looking again at the martyrologies, the hagiography and the historiography has allowed us to separate the real historical Curadán from his later alter ego Boniface. We've seen that the legend of Curetánus seems to preserve near contemporary confirmation that Curadán founded the Church of Rosemarkie and was buried there. And we've seen place name evidence indicating that he and his cult were only ever active in Easter Ross and Inverness-shire. It seems likely that he became associated with Angus from a misinterpretation of the name of the river Gobriat, where he founded a church. This church was very probably not at Invergowrie, and there's a good chance that it was somewhere around Altgowrie near Muir of Ord. Now, this all suggests a lesser role for Curadán in late 7th and early 8th century Pictland than has been proposed in the past. But I think it argues for a stronger and clearer role for him in the Moray Firthlands. We may with some confidence say that he was Bishop of Ross, that his diocese may have extended from Glenurquhart to Strathrory, that he was very probably the founder of the monastery of Rosemarkie, and that he died and was interred there sometime between 697 and 740. The Church of Rosemarkie may have reinvented him as Pope Boniface IV, perhaps as a last resort in the face of a 12th century existential crisis. But memory of the real Curadán has been preserved, embedded in calendars, legends, and the place names of Ross and Inverness-shire. So thank you for listening. And a very quick thanks to my PhD supervisors, Professors Catherine Forsyth and Thomas Clancy, for their support and feedback as I've researched this topic. And here's a link to my blog, which has it's changed. I've just moved it, but that's where it is now. And this is where you can get in touch with me. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Fiona. Wow, that was an absolute tour de force of your amazing ability to uncover things and and link them very cautiously. You're always very cautious, which is great. But yeah, fantastic. I think you've thrown a huge amount of new light on the whole subject. It's absolutely great to be sure that he was Abbot of Ross and at the right time. I mean, I didn't know anything about this discovery of the the concatenation of the names that led to the puzzle about the place names. So yeah, absolutely blown away by that. Fantastic. Thank you very much. We must publish it. And hopefully you can come up with a text and images and so on so that we can get this published. So I asked people to put questions in the chat, and there weren't many, but some things are appearing. Oh no, just congratulations at the moment. No questions. Um,
I would just say, Alistair, that you said you didn't realise that this discovery, but this is new. So I am really interested in hearing what anybody has to say, if
yeah,
anything, about the possibility that that this text was early and it was produced at Rosemarkie. I mean, it's quite incredible to think that it may actually, some of those words may actually have been written in Rosemarkie in the monastery there. So
yeah. Well, like you, I think we like to assume that there was a scriptorium that was up to the same things that they were up to in Portmahomack. Yeah, I just one thing to bring up. I mean, and I don't know how relevant this is, but our cross slab at Rosemarkie it has to have some clues in all this, I feel, because it's so untypical of a Pictish cross slab. The Hendersons pointed to the fact that there, and I don't remember which elements they are, but that the elements of the decoration are rather Northumbrian in style. And I've often wondered whether it isn't some form of statement about this change to the Roman way of things. It seems to be trying to give some sort of a message. It's so carefully designed. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
yes, well, I mean, I'm absolutely not an art historian, so I'm on very dodgy
Right,
ground already. I think that the dates don't quite match up with
right.
the transition to the Roman Church in Pictland was in the early 8th century. So it was
Yes. Okay.
717 was Nechten's campaign of
A
reform.
bit too
That
early.
cross-slab, I mean, the Hendersons put that, and I'm willing to hear other views, but the Hendersons put that very late, the cross slab, like sort of, around about 800, probably one of
Yeah.
the latest cross slabs that was raised. The Northumbrian elements in the sculpture could just be a factor of, the insular culture of the time was, very, everybody was swapping ideas with everybody else and, swapping
Mm.
techniques with
Mhm.
everybody else. There's not
Yeah.
necessarily anything
Yeah.
political in sort of Northumbrian elements to the sculpture. I'm already
Mhm.
getting out of my depth. But yeah, I mean, it certainly is. It certainly is not like any of the other cross slabs. It really is unique. Yeah.
There has to be a reason for that.
Yeah.
Some to be discovered. Yes. The other thing I was going to observe was and my local geography may be suspect, but the mouth of the Gowrie burn in that flows through Alt Gowrie
Mm.
can't be a million miles away from where the Conan stone was discovered.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I spent ages once I thought that this might not refer to Invergary and it might refer to the
Mm.
Gary Burn. I spent ages trying to make the mouth of the Gary Burn be at be at Logie Wester. And I thought, have the courses of the rivers maybe changed? But I can't do it. I can't do it. So I think that if there was a church there,
Mm.
it's not that same site.
Right. Mm.
And
Mhm.
there is the kind of, I mean, ethnicity is something that I think we over focus on, but there is the kind of contrast that Logie Wester has this Pictish place name element login, and
Mm.
it has this Pictish sound, whereas Curadán, and there's a question there from Jonathan Wordsworth saying, is the name Curadán Gallic? Yes, I think it is. I think it is. It is a Gallic name. There are other Curadans in Ireland, and
Okay.
the sort of
So
churches. Ross has a very Gallic feel about it in the early Middle Ages, rather than a Pictish feel. So I feel like if he had founded a church at the mouth of that river, it wouldn't be the one with the Pictish cross slab.
right, okay. Fascinating. What else do we have? Oh, there's da, 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 da. Yes, the
Yeah.
publication.
Sorry.
So Carly McNamara says, I do have a question in light of some of the discussion of carvings at Rosemarkie. Oh, give me a moment to type it out.
She has typed it out.
Here we go further down. So Cynthia Thickpenny suggested a master carver or carving school, potentially based at Rosemarkie, with evidence of similar carving at Nig, Rosemarkie, Applecross, and perhaps at other wider locations. With what you've seen about Curadán's diocese, does this possibility make sense to you as you understand it?
Yeah, thanks, Carly. Well, it does. It does in that I think, I mean, this is, like trying to make a narrative out of almost nothing. But it feels to me like this diocese was taken over. And it doesn't, I mean, we do have in the Irish annals that, the familiar of Iona was expelled from Pictland. And then presumably the Pictish church took over. And that kind of is what I see, but not at that time. I kind of see this happening like much later in the 8th century, that something happened to this diocese. A Pictish church authority moved in and was responsible for some of these carvings. And so that would fit with the cross-slab at Rosemarkie, the one at Nig, and maybe the one at Applecross. Yeah, Carly, you probably know better than I do that if there's dating for the one at Applecross. I've read Cynthia's paper a couple of times, but I don't know if she's actually kind of put a date range on any of these three sculptures. But I would see it as post-dating the diocese of Curadán's diocese of Ross.
Right, right. Fascinating. Yeah, I'm sure the cross slab has to fit into this somehow.
Oh, it must do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's such a statement. Yeah, it must do. Yeah.
It may not have been the only one. I mean, if Portmahomack is anything to go by, then there was probably more than one cross slab at Rosemarkie. We just haven't found the others yet.
Yes. Well, I mean, there's certainly other cross slabs, and there's certainly other sculpture. But are any of them were any of them cross slabs? Maybe I think some of them are smaller memorial stones, aren't they? Yeah.
Yes, yes. I have this theory that there are others out there somewhere. Martin Carver suggested that the cross slabs around the Tarbert Peninsula coast were kind of markers of the wider territory of the monastery, and also designed to be visible from the sea, to mark out good landing places. And if the Black Isle was the same sort of estate area for Rosemarkie, then there are places around the Black Isle where you might expect a cross slab to be found.
Yes, yeah, and when Gilbert Marcus did his lecture, he talked about some of those, I think, other sites for crosses that were like Corselet. I think he said there was probably a cross there, and there was one on the Chellenary Ness as well.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a huge helpful work by Jill Harden, by the way. We're pretty close to publishing Gilbert's talk.
Oh, brilliant.
Watch this space. So here we are. Your colleague David has got a question here.
Has got an easy question?
Without me reading it.
What do you think it says about the perception of Curadán and Rosemarkie at Rosteneth, that Rosteneth seems to have co-opted the legend such that Curadán was also active further south? Yeah, well, it doesn't mention Curadán. It just says Boniface. This is the one thing that I don't know. I don't know how he has jumped to Rosteneth and been co-opted, or if it was originally a separate legend of a separate saint and they've become kind of knitted together. I don't know. That's one thing that that's one of the loose ends that I haven't been able to tie up.
Yeah, it kind of smacks of another sort of mix up in manuscript copying or something.
Yeah,
So
there's so much that we can't
things
see. There's so much of
happen.
the manuscript
Mm.
transmission and copying that we don't see that it's hard to trace what's happened. I hope that maybe somebody else will give this some thought from the kind of Ristennith Angus point of view. Yeah, because my focus is pretty much on the Firthlands.
Yes. Well, you've certainly provided plenty of inspiration for other people to look into, I think. All right. Well, it looks as though we're running out of questions at the moment. Yes. Okay. So, time for me to say, well, absolutely huge thank you again. I think this will go down as one of the more outstanding annual academic lectures that we've had. It's so wonderfully relevant to the museum and its immediate uh, purpose kind of thing. So absolutely wonderful. Thank you, thank you.
Pleasure.